want to thank you for including me in this important discussion about Emancipation Day. And I'm familiar with Dr. Vibe from earlier days when he was just starting out. I certainly have had the privilege of working with Peter. I support Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. And Sarah, of course, I'm familiar with you from before the realization of Black History Ottawa. So all of you have done phenomenal things, and I'm very proud to be on this panel with you. But just to give a bit of a mini historical overview, I began my journey on working to commemorate August the 1st as Emancipation Day soon after I had also started the journey to see about the formalization of February as Black History Month. So in terms of Emancipation Day, I, in cooperation with the Caribbean Historical Society of Trinidad and Tobago, started to work on reviving what was a once annual celebration that existed throughout the British Empire. And of course, that was in response to the passage of the 1833 British Imperial Act, the legislation that abolished chattel slavery outright. In Canada and several other British-controlled areas of the world, it did not go into effect until August 1st, 1834. And but of course, in some places, such as Jamaica that Sarah, you mentioned, it didn't really go into effect until 1838 with a gradual emancipation or an apprenticeship system. The significance of August 1st as Emancipation Day is that it was the first global human rights act facilitating freedom for Africans from chattel slavery, and for others, the hope that emancipation would soon be theirs. Following this British move to end slavery outright, other global powers followed suit, leading to the current situation in which slavery, from birth to death, for successive generations, was abolished. The abolition of chattel slavery came about due to the agency, the efforts, the initiatives of enslaved Africans and free Africans to rid themselves of a horrendous experience and a life marked by ownership, lack of ownership of themselves, excruciatingly long and difficult working situations that were all sustained and perpetuated by violence or victimization. It's their strength and their courage to resist their circumstances from capture through to plantation revolt that is incredibly remarkable. And that is what merits our commemoration. We honor our ancestors for the brave steps they took. However, it was perhaps the larger acts that garnered the greatest change. Abolition followed the most successful revolution against slavery in the West and the creation of the first African-controlled nation, Haiti, following the successful revolution led by Toussaint Louverture. Abolitionists of African, European, and indigenous backgrounds found their efforts making more headway. In Britain, the efforts of William Wilberforce culminated in the abolition of the British-controlled transatlantic slave trade. It was his view that the voyage was the most heinous aspect of enslavement, and ending it would end much suffering. While he may not have imagined what restrictions and what intensified actions had developed to increase and maintain enslaved populations, it did ameliorate the situation of still enslaved Africans. And of course, our very first Lieutenant Governor, John Graves Simcoe, did attempt, following the capture of Chloe Cooley, did attempt to effect an end to slavery in what is now called Ontario. But he was forced to pass compromise legislation in 1793. Going back to the transatlantic slave trade and the 1807 abolition of that, it didn't free an enslaved African, but it did add to the movement to bring about its demise. It was the British Imperial Act that ended chattel slavery. So it is this that we celebrate, that we celebrated spontaneously in the early hours of August 1st, 1834, in many locations in Canada and, of course, worldwide. It was this that led to the shouting, the praying, the parading, the dancing, the singing, the full celebration of being free. The freedom from chattel slavery was the thing that needed to be addressed in 1834. But freedom, as recently departed John Lewis reminds us, is not a place, but a process. Freedom in 2020 means many different things that I'm sure we will discuss further today. Transformation comes about through a process, and the process of our freedom began with our efforts to resist. And it was furthered by our combined efforts to challenge and change laws and practices that resulted in our freedom.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosemary. It's very important to have that whole, of course, you're an educator and a historian, so you would be the person to say that. And might I add that Rosemary is a descendant of enslaved people in Ontario. I think it's 7 generations, right, Rosemary? Or more?
Well, I'm actually connected to the first 4 waves of migration of Black people to this country.
Wow. Okay.
The Loyalists, the late Loyalists, the refugees of the War of 1812, and the Underground Railroad.
Yeah. So we're going to move along to another descendant of these Africans who were enslaved, and this is now Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. Senator, can you talk to us about your journey in commemorating Emancipation Day?
So thank you very much, and I add my appreciation to what Rosemary has already stated. You know, this is an important conversation to be having, and so it's really good to see it continue. And this is a show that reaches, I think, an important segment of our communities across the country. So thank you, Dr. Vibe. And Sarah, Black History Ottawa, really pleased that you're doing this. So first of all, a little correction in the bio. You said I'm a former social worker. I'm still a social worker. I maintain my social work license because I think it's important to bring that social work lens to the work that I do in the Senate. And I certainly try to do that. And I also want to just mention that although I'm the first woman African Nova Scotian senator, I'm actually the 3rd African Nova Scotian senator. The first was Senator Oliver, who retired about 6 years ago. And then Senator Ruck, who only served 2 years because he was appointed when he was 73 years of age. And of course, I'm sure everyone knows, mandatory retirement is at 75. So at the time that I was appointed to the Senate, I was, and am still, the first African Nova Scotian woman. My family's roots in Nova Scotia date back to the 1700s. So the Loyalists and also the Maroons are part of my ancestry. And several of my ancestors came through the Underground Railroad, and some came after the War of 1812. So long roots in Nova Scotia. Being appointed to the Senate has been an important step in my journey. And when I think about the work specifically on Emancipation Day, I would say that it started because of the for me, it started because of the inquiry that I introduced in May of 2018. I introduced an inquiry into anti-Black racism, because in my first 2 years on Parliament Hill, I was just so, I was becoming more and more upset about the anti-Black racism, individual acts of racism, acts of racist microaggressions, but also the systemic racism. It was just so visible to me, everywhere I turned, it seemed, but so invisible to most of my colleagues. And of course, as you know, senators are appointed to represent the voice of those who are voiceless. Senators are appointed to represent minority interest. They're supposed to be bringing these interests forward. But in my humble opinion, many of my colleagues had very little, if any, awareness about the very real conditions of African Canadians. So I introduced this inquiry into anti-Black racism, and I'll never forget on the day that I stood to make the announcement that I would be moving this motion. One of my colleagues leaned forward, a white male, leaned forward to me and said, "What in the heck is anti-Black racism?" And I leaned back to him and said, "That's exactly why I've introduced this inquiry, because you folks don't know what anti-Black racism is." So, and that inquiry happened over a period of about a year and a half. And it was through that inquiry that I learned of the efforts of Rosemary and others to bring forward national recognition of Emancipation Day. I was certainly aware of Emancipation Day. I was aware of earlier celebrations in Nova Scotia, but they had stopped taking place for a number of years. And the more I learned about Emancipation Day in Ontario and the efforts that were being put forward to try to have Emancipation Day nationally recognized, the more I realized that this had to be something that we had to move forward with. So I introduced this private, in the Senate, it's called a public bill, S-255, to have Emancipation Day nationally recognized. And unfortunately, it became, part of the political process, just like in previous efforts to have it introduced in the House of Commons. It did not pass second reading because of there was not the political will to have it put on the agenda. So if it doesn't make it to the order paper, it doesn't come to a vote. I firmly believe that it would have come, if it had come to a vote, it would have been passed. But the official opposition in the Senate would not allow it to come before the Senate for a vote. And then, of course, we had the 2019 election.